Welcome to the channel, everybody. I am the Trashy Historian. Today, we're in Wetumpka, Alabama. We're at Fort Toulouse National Historic Site, and I'm going to share everything I know about Fort Toulouse with you. Fort Toulouse was built in 1717 by the French. At that time in history, this was the Wild West. When you say Wild West, everybody thinks of Tombstone and Wyatt Earp, Arizona, Utah, Nevada. Nope. Right before the American Revolution, and even shortly thereafter, this was the Wild West. Alabama, Mississippi, most of Tennessee. 1717, the French, who owned New Orleans, Louisiana, this was the far eastern part of their territory. So they built this fort to have trading relations with what's known as the Creek Muskogee Indians. And this fort lasted a good number of years up until the Treaty of Paris that ended the French Indian War. Now, at that time, the British went and built a fort called Fort Wetumpka, about 30 miles from here, right outside of Dadeville, Alabama. That was the far western part of the British colonies. Still, the Wild West of the 1700s. Now, after the Treaty of Paris, the French pretty much abandoned the fort here and left Alabama, leaving it to the British. But at this time, across the Coosa River from Fort Toulouse was a town, an Indian town, Native American. I will use the term Indian, I'm sorry. It's what I grew up with. Was a Indian town called Hickory Ground. Hickory Ground is actually still disputed today by factions of the Creek Muskogee Indians, 200 plus years later. Now, Fort Toulouse lasted a while. The town lasted a while. The town flourished here even in the early 1800s. And in 1813, this sleepy little quiet country area was brought into more turmoil by Andrew Jackson. This is 6 years before the territory of Alabama becomes the state of Alabama. And at this time, there was a jail, actually not too far from where we're at right now. And this was the original county seat of Montgomery County, Alabama. In 1817, the county seat got moved from here to the town of Montgomery proper. The town pretty much disappeared in 1827 when a massive scarlet fever and yellow fever epidemic came to the townsfolks. On the way in, we passed some little swampy areas. Let me explain this to you. Where we're sitting at now is the convergence of the Coosa River on my right, the Tallapoosa River on my left. Directly behind where I'm facing forms the Alabama River. The Alabama River is navigable all the way to Mobile. This was a very important junction for the Creek Muskogee Indians, because in canoes you could travel all the way up the Coosa River to places such as Sylacauga, Talladega, Tallahatchie. And on the Tallapoosa River, you could actually travel by canoe up to a little town called Tallahassee. And right below Tallahassee, which is nothing but a rocky area, was the Creek Confederacy capital of Tuckabashie. That's where all of the war chiefs from the Muskogee tribes got together, and they made yearly visits. That's where they made laws. That's where they made war declarations from, was in Tuckabatchie. All of that will come into play in the 1813 time period. Or as what Americans like to call the War of 1812, which was actually two wars being fought at the same time. But enough about that. Today we're going to talk about Fort Toulouse. Y'all ready? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Fort Toulouse. We're going to talk a little bit about fortifications. Fortifications in the 1700s were basically just little tree limbs, little logs. They weren't built too high up because, think about it, who's going to carry a ladder out here? And at that time, the Native Americans, the Creek Muskogees, that were hostile to those who were not trading, sometimes they were hostile to those who were trading. They did not have the cannon or the weaponry basically to annihilate these logs. Now, you could get struck by a little arrow through here, but also think of the 50 French Marines that were stationed in this fort. The 50 French Marines had flintlock muskets, so they had a range of about 75 to 100 yards. And from here, I'd be dead. Now, from this viewpoint, you can see where if I had an arrow or a tomahawk, I'm not going to be very effective against the about 10-foot tall wooden stakes in the ground. These trunks are cut into quarters, and that allows them to put a point outside and a point inside. As you're staring at the wall, it's a very tiny slit for, say, an arrow or a bullet to get through. It is a defensive way of building a fort cheaper than just using a whole entire log. I've shown you the walls. I've shown you where the men fired or take up firing positions against an approaching enemy. But you may have a question in your mind. Why is this fortification so small? I only see two chimneys here. I only see another wall 50 foot that way. There's a white building here. And as I continue to walk around, there's another building. Why was the fortification so small? Well, most people actually lived outside the fort. You had gardens outside the fort. You had a blacksmith outside the fort. You had everything outside the fort because living conditions in here would have been cramped. Basically, what you see in here is the necessities needed in case of a multi-day siege by an enemy. If they approach and they cut off your route to get supplies from outside the fort, you actually had a mess hall that could cook meals for a couple of days. You actually had a place that could bake bread. You had an emergency blacksmith's area, and you had a small barracks where men could take respite when they were not on duty. And of course, naturally, this big building is going to be the officers' quarters because we all know that officers have to have the cushiest of the cushy. Fort Toulouse was rebuilt in the 1980s. The centennial of America's freedom in 1976, there was a group of people here in Wetumpka that wanted to rebuild Fort Toulouse. Sadly, they built it on Fort Jackson, which we'll show you in a little bit. The state got control of the property, even though this is a national historic site. The state got control of the property in the 1980s and rebuilt Fort Toulouse based on the original plans from William Bartram, the naturalist who came through here in 1776. They recreated the buildings exactly to how they would have been built back then. As you can see here, they would have had timbers like this going up through. They would have woven vines in and then packed those vines with mud, because that did actually help insulate these buildings. Then they would have come through and plastered over it so that the mud and the vines would be intact. This is very indicative of the building type in the 1700s, even into the 1800s. A lot of the actual buildings that you see, the Native Americans, the Creek Muskogees, actually had this type of structure in it. And so the French, the British, the colonials used this type of structure because if it worked here for several thousand years, why would it not work in their buildings? So what you see here is actually indicative of a 400-year-old, 500-year-old building here in the North American continent. Directly north of the fort of Toulouse was the Creek Muskogee Indian town of Hickory Ground, which is still being disputed today between the Creek Muskogee Indians of Oklahoma and the modern Porch Band of Creek Indians. This is an Indian burial mound. Indian burial mounds were very important to the indigenous people of Alabama. Most Native American, Creek Muskogee, Cherokee, Choctaw, and including a lot of Southern people, we hang on to a lot of our ancestry. And burial mounds, especially for the village here, the village of Hickory Ground right across the river, were very important to the people that were here at that time. Still are very important to the modern Muskogee Creek out in Oklahoma, and even the Porch Band of Creek Indians. That's where they came from. That's who they strive to be. The manliest of men, the warrior, the strongest of the warriors. As you can see, they don't come out here and clean the ground. They don't touch it because it's considered sacred for the Creek Muskogee Indians. This one has been around since about 1000 AD. So for 800 years, the Little Creek Indian towns along the river here on the Coosa and the Tallapoosa would come and bury their mothers and fathers here. There are quite a few indigenous Indian mounds in Alabama. You can look up the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail, brought to you by the University of Alabama, basically headquartered at Moundville in Alabama. And they're dotted all over the state. And I suggest you just take a day and make a few trips to some burial mounds and let the ancestor spirit flow through you. We might have that on a future episode as well. In 1776, William Bartram left his house in Philadelphia, and he went on a tour throughout the Southeast to document, basically do a Charles Darwin, document the animals, the flowers, the trees, and the species, the topography of the Southeast United States. He came in through Savannah, Georgia, in through Alabama, and one of the places he came to was Fort Toulouse. It's from William Bartram and his descriptions that we know a lot about the area. It's from a few diaries from people that were from Fort Toulouse / Fort Jackson town in the early 1800s that we know about this area. Well, to my right and to my left is where the cemetery was. In 1817, the town here was the county seat of Montgomery County. Well, in 1819, Alabama became a state. That same time, the county seat of Montgomery County was moved to Montgomery proper. There were still a few people who were living here, and in 1827, they all got wiped out by scarlet and yellow fever from the swamps. They were all buried here. Shortly after that, the United States government, after the Civil War era, came in and dug up as many people as they could, shipped them down to Mobile, and reinterred them in the Mobile National Cemetery. There are still people buried here today. 20 years ago, you can't really tell it today because of the grass, but 20 years ago, you could still see the depressions in the ground from where they had dug up bodies over 100 years ago. To me, this is kind of a sacred area, but had it not been for William Bertram and a handful of diaries from people who lived here in the early 1800s, we would have never known a lot about Fort Toulouse and Fort Jackson Town. I'm the Trashy historian, and I have really enjoyed presenting to you the history of Fort Toulouse, named after Louis Alexander Bourbon, Vicomte de Toulouse of France. I hope you have enjoyed this video. Please like the channel, comment, follow my Facebook page, set notifications, unsubscribe, do all that stuff they tell you to do on these documentaries and podcasts. And I look forward to giving you the next video presentation or the next Veterans Voices presentation. I am the Trashy Historian.